Yesterday, the International Energy Agency released Oil 2021, its latest medium-term market report, which is attracting considerable attention in oil-producing economies around the world. The forecast for global oil demand has shifted lower, and demand could peak earlier than previously thought if a rising focus by governments on clean energy turns into support for stronger policies and behavioral changes induced by the pandemic become deeply rooted. I'll be speaking with Olivier Lejeune, oil analyst with the IEA. So welcome to the interview, Olivier.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Now, I think most of the attention here is on the difference between your base case, which shows actually a growth of 4 million barrels a day in demand by 2026, with an accelerated case brought on with different policies and more electrification of transportation. So why don't if you could just give us a brief description of those two cases, please.
Yeah, sure. So our base case is really what our vision for what's most likely to happen over the next 5 to 6 years. So it includes essentially a recovery from the pandemic, starting from the second half of 2021 with widespread vaccinations. It includes electrification of a substantial portion of new vehicles. It includes some assumptions on teleworking even after the pandemic is over. And taking all of that into account, we basically see demand recovering from the pandemic by sort of 2023 or 2024. So in a few years from now. The alternative case explores what needs to be done for demand to peak between now and 2026. And in a nutshell, a huge amount needs to be done for this to happen. We would need widespread regulations around the world to trigger really a fall in demand, given really the dynamism from emerging economies in Asia, which are continuing to grow and continuing to need more mobility, plastics, etc. So, yeah, the alternative case is very demanding. It's almost, you could say, almost impossible that this will happen because it requires very strong and very quick action from many, many governments.
Is it fair to say, Olivier, that even under the base case, we still see peak oil demand occurring sometime during the 2020s?
I wouldn't say so, no. I'd say it's a possibility even in the base case. It's unlikely to be over the next 5 to 6 years for sure, I would say. But it could happen in the 2020s, so in the second half of the decade. But I wouldn't say it's likely to happen. I'd say that's one of the possibilities amongst all of the unknowns. But the truth is, I mean, Asia in particular is continuing to grow its demand. So that really is the bigger question: is can emerging economies adopt a path that's not oil dependent like we've done in the West? It's an unknown at the moment.
So my understanding is that most of the experts I've talked to think that the changes in demand will be, as they say, asymmetrical. So we'll see demand falling in Europe for sure, in North America, possibly in China as China electrifies its transportation. But so that you'll see that peaking for sure and probably falling by mid-2020s. But it really is the story here is the rising demand in Asia. So is there, in other parts of Asia, so is there any momentum for policy changes and behavioral changes that you see in Asia, in other parts of Asia, that could lead to your accelerated case?
There is definitely momentum behind net zero and behind electrification of the transport sector in Asia. No doubt about it. Whether it's strong enough to to lead to a peak in demand over the next 10 years? I don't think so. I think it would require additional policies in countries such as China and India. And those countries have adopted long-term targets, but they're not really going to affect the mix over the next 10 years. So for us, it seems very likely that those countries will continue to demand more oil over the next decade.
What role will the Biden administration and its commitment to net zero and to lowering emissions and showing leadership on the international stage, might that be a bit of a wild card?
It definitely helps, and it's a trigger for many countries, because the US is the most powerful country on the planet, and the country that everyone looks to for environmental and energy policy. So yeah, it is definitely helpful, and it will be important. But I think at the end of the day, every country is free to do what they want in terms of energy policy, and I think Asian economies are not going to put their growth and economic development at risk just because Joe Biden, is more interested in climate change and net zero than Donald Trump was. So it's definitely a help, but it's whether it's enough to really trigger a peak in demand over the next 10 years. I personally don't think so. For us, the alternative case highlights really the gap that exists between existing policies and what needs to be done for oil demand to peak.
Now, the role of electrification of transportation, because we've seen some new forecasts come out for battery prices from Bloomberg NEF, for instance, that show battery prices falling faster than expected. We've seen a number of announcements from the automakers, the big ones. Volkswagen would be the latest, that they want to accelerate the switch to electric vehicles. What role do those trends play in your analysis?
So it's definitely one of the things we're watching. I mean, in the past, you could say that humans haven't been very good at sort of forecasting quick adoptions of new technology, and maybe we are underestimating the sort of change in electric vehicles that's happening now. But at the same time, it's also true that when you buy a car, you typically keep it for 15 or 20 years. So right now, we've only got about 4 to 5% of global sales being electric. So, I mean, for the total car fleet to really switch to a non-fossil fuel fired fleet, this will take several years and probably more than that. So there is strong momentum, but yeah, it will take a while.
So just to wrap up, Olivier, even under, say, a more cautious model or case, is it fair to say that peak oil demand is coming and we're going to see it? The question now is, when will it be? Mid-decade, later in the decade, 2030? Is that fair to say, or is there any kind of a case where we actually see oil consumption growing until well into the 2030s, as was the case, not that long ago?
I'd say it's fair to say that the peak in demand is coming at some point, which is in itself quite revolutionary. Remember, just 10 years ago, we were more worried about peak supply, and peak demand, wasn't really on the cards. Now we're saying this could happen, as soon as 2030, maybe, and probably before 2050. So it is quite a change, but yes, this could be derailed, if you've got a complete breakdown in climate negotiations, and if countries do not adopt tough climate change targets, you could see that target being derailed, I think.
Olivier, thank you very much for this. Really appreciate it.
No problem at all.